morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome all worldwide audience and participants to this important Congress. I'm Maha Talaat. I'm the Regional Advisor for AMR and IPC at the WHO Regional Office, Eastern Mediterranean Region in Cairo, Egypt. I would like to welcome you all to session 3 of the conference, Antimicrobial Resistance and Emerging Global Health Threat. We have a group of very interesting presentations provided by eminent worldwide scientists, and start by introducing the first presentation with the title Keynote, One Health Approach to AMR and Global Health Threats, provided by Dr. Ilaria Capua from the Emerging Pathogens Institute, University of Florida, United States of America. The floor is yours, Ilaria.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman. Thank you very much to our hosts, and it is a great pleasure to be here, and it is an extremely exciting moment for me because I am a virologist, and I am here talking to a group of people who are interested in sepsis and in bacteriology. But I think I have a case for you, and so please try and follow me in my trail of thought, because I think we have a fantastic opportunity which lies in the midst of the fog, the energy, and the despair that COVID-19 has caused. So I will start with a picture of Alexander Fleming, who is the person who discovered penicillin and also was awarded a Nobel Prize for this, who actually identified antimicrobial resistance right at the start. From day one, he was he had learned so much about his discovery that he had actually pushed his discovery a little bit further. He was able to understand that educated bacteria wouldn't find their way to fight antibiotics and antimicrobials. And this is what I will talk to you about. This slide is about how AMR has shown us that it has a circular nature. In many, many representations of AMR, we see how this phenomenon passes from animals to humans, to the water, to the hospitals, to the soil, to the plants, back into humans, and back into animals. And even the WHO, yes, that was the slide that I was talking about, actually depicted it as a circle. I have looked into how has health been imagined in a circular manner, because we know we have circular economy, we have circular agriculture, but we don't have circular health. And so I looked back into old dusty books and into ancient literature next to find out that the ancient Greeks had actually a very integrated view of health. They had a central part which had the world, mundus, annus, time, and homo, man. And then a series of external variables, which, according to the ancient philosophers, influenced our health. And the first one is, of course, air. Does air influence our health? Yes, it does. The second one is water, aqua. This element, of course, next slide, please. This element, of course, is extremely interconnected. The water that we flush down the toilet is the water that we drink. We have a serious problem with pollution of seawater, with pollution of fresh water. Water can become powerful, water can become poisonous. And so also this element is an element that influences our health. But it is also land that influences our health, the quality of the land, the quality of the soil, the quality of the products that come out of the land. We receive globalized vegetables and fruits and meat from all over the world, and that the quality of those fruit and of those vegetables, of those plants, the solidity of that soil, from all of those elements depend our health. Next. And the last cornerstone of this beautiful picture is fire. And fire, if you think about it, can be reflected in modern times with heat, the sun, global warming, but also the fires. The fires are devastating the United States. They are devastated. They have devastated Australia. And of course, these powerful fires influence our health. They influence the air, they influence biodiversity, and they contribute to a general erosion of the planet resources. Next. And so as we look at antimicrobial resistance is actually the perfect example to look at health in a circular manner. And this is a call for all of you that understand the complexity of antimicrobial resistance, or maybe that need more elements to understand the complexity of antimicrobial resistance. And why is this call coming now? Because COVID-19 is truly an epochal event. It has stopped the world for a while. It will change the world economy. And while we continue to wash our hands and we distance and we stay at home if we have a fever and a cough, we have to come to terms with the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we are ready to learn from this pandemic and this experience. So there is a saying that is, every cloud has a silver lining. I believe that the pandemic cloud has a rainbow within. And the rainbow within is that it can help us to understand why we need to advance health as a system. Within the Sustainable Development Goals, we should be aiming at co-advancing the health of humans, animals, plants, and the environment. And we can do this with a circular approach. If we look at all the elements that I mentioned and see how they influence our health, and we put as a node big data, we can start looking at health as one big puzzle. And this is where we need to go with the increasing computing capacity, the increasing data availability, and the need we have to not go back where we were before the pandemic. So a few words on big data. How can big data transform how we look at health? Let me tell you that at the moment, the definition of health, which has changed in time, we know it has only in recent times included mental health, is currently applied to only one species inhabiting the planet, Homo sapiens. And given that the health of Homo sapiens is interconnected and interdependent with that of other animals, plants, and the environment, it would be seem reasonable to try and apply a circular approach, which is more respectful of natural balances and other species. We do have the data. And here, next slide, and this brings me to my last slide, which is 3 ideas which spur from the COVID-19 pandemic on AMR. So now is the time to monitor if improved and increased hygiene measures have an impact on AMR and on hospital-borne infections. I have done extensive literature research on this and have not been able to find a consensus yet. And so this is the time to really look into what is happening. It is a moment in which we have to push and expand public health measures, including washing our hands and flu vaccination, and several other public health measures which could have positive long-term effects. And then COVID-19 has forced us to conduct a real-life experiment on which was unimaginable only a year ago. It has highlighted the fragility of some systems, and we need to address these fragile systems. But above all, it provides us with an excuse. And this excuse we can use to finally embrace sustainability. Thank you very much, and I wish you an excellent rest of the meeting.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, for this interesting presentation. And I'm very, very impressed with the concept of the circular approach for health that you introduced. We have many comments from the audience, and they are all showing really interest in knowing more about what you have presented. Unfortunately, because of the time, we will proceed to the second presentation. And the second presentation title is Novel Medicines Project, Driving Reinvestment in Research and Development and Responsible Antibiotic Use. And this is going to be provided by Dr. Stephan Harbarth, the Infection Control Program, Geneva University Hospital, Switzerland. Over to you, Stephan.
Thank you very much, Maha. Good morning, good afternoon to all colleagues. It's a pleasure to present this short presentation about driving reinvestment in research and development and responsible antibiotic use. So this is a more technical talk about the Drive a B project, was IMI funded over 3.5 years and finished about a year and a half ago. So I will present you some of the outputs, especially concerning the incentives that we need to really revitalize the antibiotic R&D pipeline over the next 2 decades. So as you all know, this is quite clear that our current pipeline for truly innovative antibiotics in different stages of R&D is insufficient, especially when we talk about the truly novel antibiotics that target critical WHO priority pathogens, especially on the gram-negative side. So therefore, this Drive a B project looked into potential solutions, how to provide incentives that this situation could be changed, and we came out with 4 major ideas of incentives that would be the most effective in stimulating the entire antibiotic R&D pipeline, but also ensure access and sustainable use over the next decades. So the first 2 are the so-called push incentives, more early at the R&D stage. So grants, for instance, pipeline coordinators, that means governmental or non-profit organizations that track the antibiotic pipeline, identify gaps, and provide support. But then also the pull incentives, and I will talk about that in more details, like market entry rewards, very controversial financial instrument to pay companies for the development of very innovative drugs. And then finally, something very important, the long-term supply continuity model that is really targeting on providing a supply of important generic antibiotics for long periods of time without any kind of significant shortages. So, of course, these different mechanisms of re-incentivizing, they go hand in hand. There's no one single solution. So, of course, everybody tries to find the right combination, and because these different incentives target different moments in the R&D pipeline, as you can see on this slide. So, for instance, grants, they come very early on at the basic science stage versus market entry rewards. Of course, they concern more the later stages of antibiotic approval. So if we go into details, number one, very easy, that of course we should provide a strong incentive to basic research in form of grants. This is something where we have already quite important investment all around the world, but definitely we need more coordination. And yes, there could also be room for further targeted funding to make sure that the developments, the scientific work is really targeting the unmet clinical needs. Then pipeline coordinators, that's something very important that has grown over the last 5 years. An example is, for instance, CARBIX or GARD-P. These are non-for-profit institutions that address different public health priorities where there is insufficient investment, and they try to coordinate the allocation of resources to fill the priority gaps. So the key functions of these coordinators include the gap analysis, providing financing, but also trying to coordinate with the different stakeholders, public and private, and try to be some deal makers. I don't have time to go into any details, but as an example, a recent one is the AMR Action Fund that also tries to bridge the gap in antibiotic R&D and provide more interesting conditions to reestablish what they call an innovative ecosystem. This fund has been created recently. It's mostly supported by pharmaceutical industry partners, but there are also some philanthropies and development banks that are included in this kind of organization. Then the third major incentives that we try to develop, again, this is a pretty controversial subject, that are the market entry rewards. The background idea is that currently the market incentives are not stimulating enough innovation, because of course, if we have novel drugs, currently we always try to be very careful about the use of these novel drugs. So there is very little marketing pressure, let's say, that is successful in convincing physicians to prescribe these novel drugs like ceftazidime, avibactam, like they did 30, 40 years ago with other broad-spectrum antibiotics. So companies earn not enough on these kind of drugs. So therefore, there could be a payment, like a bonus, that is provided by governmental agencies, by public money, to tell companies, okay, if you provide and if you develop a very novel drug, then you get a sort of a bonus payment up front or even later that ensures that you have enough return on investment. But there should be strings attached. As listed here, the market entry rewards should be targeted, they should be transparent, sufficient and supportive, truly supportive of innovative research. There are two models for these market entry rewards. Without going into any health economic details, there is a fully delinked model where all revenues associated with the chosen drug would come from payments over the lifetime of the patent. So here there would be no additional income from sales, whereas the partially delinked model that is shown here would allow annual sales also to fill the pocket of the companies. So here there would be a sort of a starting payment bonus at the beginning, but then over time the annual sales would jump in to make sure that the companies get enough return on investment. So these kind of models are extremely controversial. I can just tell you that when you talk to different stakeholders and partners, that there is no real consensus on these kind of mechanisms. However, there is maybe a little bit more consensus on the long-term supply continuity model, which means that everybody agrees that there are some rarely used antibiotics that are still essential, that are very important, or there are more commonly used antibiotics that experience from time to time severe drug shortages and will influence the clinical prescribing practices quite substantially. Lately, there has been, for instance, quite a substantial piperacillin tazobactam shortage that really impacted clinical care all over the world. So this supply continuity model is intended to make sure that there is no major interruption in drug supply, that there is no major shortage, by providing some sort of reward if a company is providing this kind of supply on a long-term basis. So an example here, what happened recently, this is in German, but I will just quickly explain. The Sandoz company, that is a daughter of Novartis, they were about to completely stop production of penicillins, amoxicillins in Europe and to delocalize to China, but the company, together with the Austrian government, decided to keep the production of penicillin in Austria. They invested 150 million euros to make sure that the production site is up to date and that there is some safe production within Europe so that we do not depend from China for importation of these essential drugs. Also a little bit maybe influenced by the recent COVID crisis. Of course, all these incentive models have to be linked to sustainable use measures and guidelines, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of my talk. If you're interested, I could provide you more details outside of this presentation. And then also very importantly, of course, is the question of equitable availability. As you all know, when there are new drugs getting on the market, low and middle income countries are predominantly the last countries that receive the new patent protected antibiotics. So here, if companies enter some of these incentive plans, especially the market entry rewards, of course, there needs to be some obligations, making sure that low and middle income countries have also access to those drugs by providing some specific obligations as listed on the slide here. Also making sure that there is some antibiotic-specific policy guidelines through, for instance, the essential medicines list to make sure that even in these low and middle-income countries, there is a minimum of antibiotic stewardship and that there is not complete overuse and misuse of those new drugs because there is a lack of monitoring. Also, in addition, of course, the Driver B project suggested stronger governance models for these kind of R&D activities around the globe, to create new international bodies that really try to coordinate and make sure that there is not this kind of heterogeneity across different countries in Asia, North America, Europe, related to trying to incentivize R&D. Also, need of increased coordination based on some of the existing organizations, and for instance, the G20 Global R&D Collaboration Hub could be considered one of those institutions that could help to coordinate. It sounds like I'm dreaming, but as you know, I'm working in Geneva, and we have the CERN, which is this collider experimental institution with more than 7,000 employees, a budget of over $1 billion, created 50 years ago, with people coming from all over the world helping to just find these kind of nanoparticles. So maybe as a dream, maybe we could make sure that in the future we have this kind of international collaborative instrument that helps to develop new antibiotics that are truly needed by our patients around the world, in particular, of course, for the WHO priority pathogens. So to finish this presentation, for those who are interested, we published a final report of this Driver B project called Revitalizing the Antibiotic Pipeline. You can see here the link. And of course, I remain available for further questions or interaction with some of you. I would also like to thank, of course, all colleagues, a lot of colleagues who contributed to the Driver B project, both from the academic and also from the industry side, to generate those recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephan, for the presentation. We do have here one or two questions. There is a question or a comment on how much new antibiotics for low middle income countries are needed if still there are not proper diagnostic solutions to ensure stewardship programs and others. Over to you, Stephan.
Yeah, definitely we need novel antibiotics. So there are, as you know, antibiotics already in the pipeline, in the advanced phase 3 pipeline, but they are pretty close to pre-existing compounds. So definitely, if we want to make sure that clinical care is not in danger, experts think that we need for the next 20 years 3, 4, maybe 5 truly innovative new antibiotics to treat gram-negative bacteria. It's maybe a little bit of wishful thinking, but I think that just developing one single new class of antibiotics would not be enough.
Thank you very much. We have also another question saying many people are currently engaged in the research or the work on EMR. What is the role from your point of view that what researchers have or scientists have in supporting the work to get more targeted funding, and how to ensure the equitable availability of new drugs for low-middle income countries? Over.
Wow. So these are two questions. So the first question is, of course, how can we engage? And I think that we just have to look at the unmet clinical needs and make sure that, of course, we try to convince large funding organizations to provide some of the basic funding to have high quality research, basic research, like it is done now at the moment in a very spectacular way for COVID, you know, and you could even look at other areas like TB research, where there has been a steady flow of funding over 30 years. And I think we need the same for AMR. For the equitable access to these novel antibiotics, your second question, honestly, I don't have a perfect solution because I'm not a dreamer. You know, everybody, all the companies in theory, they say, yeah, if we have novel drugs that got some real governmental and public money to develop, yes, we make sure that these monies, that these drugs get also to low and middle income countries. But in reality, I'm not sure how this will really function, because I have to also admit, at least to my knowledge, in many middle income countries, there are pretty weak antibiotic stewardship structures. So that means that if you get those drugs to some of these countries, for instance, Russia, I'm not so sure whether there will be reasonable and judicious use of these novel drugs. So therefore, I don't have a perfect answer to that, to make sure that countries that are not high income have full access to these novel drugs. Over.
Thank you, Stephan, for this answer. And I also echo what you've said in terms of the limited antimicrobial stewardship programs in most of the countries of low income. And at any time new drugs will be available, I believe that there will be the same ways of using those new drugs inappropriately. And then I don't think that the solution, this is going to be the solution for it. I think we also have maybe one last question before we move to the next presentation. There is a question about how many antibiotics with novel mechanisms are in the pipeline, if you can comment on this.
On the gram-positive side, there are at least 2. On the gram-negative side, in very advanced clinical development, there is none. There was one that unfortunately last year got retracted in a very advanced phase 3 clinical trial. It was a targeted anti-Pseudomonas agent, but there were too many side effects. It was a polypeptide. So unfortunately, when we look really what's very close to market approval or what has been approved already over the last 12, 18 months, 0. There have been some drugs, as I mentioned before, but they are very close cousins to already pre-existing drugs. Over.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for taking the questions of the audience. I think now we can proceed to the third presentation in this session. The title of the presentation is Cost-Effective Interventions to Combat AMR. We have Dr. Imran Hasan as the presenter, and Dr. Imran is from the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research in Bangladesh. Over to you, Dr. Imran.
Thank you for your nice introduction. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting us to present on cost-effective interventions to combat AMR. Dr. Jahil Islam was supposed to present this topic, and as his mother is sick, I am presenting on behalf of Dr. Islam. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to distinguished audience around the world. Antimicrobial resist infections are estimated to cause 700,000 deaths each year globally, and which is supposed to reach 10 million with additional 100 trillion cost, 100 trillion US dollar cost if we fail to contain AMR. As per World Bank, an additional 28 million people will be forced into extreme poverty by 2050 if we fail to contain AMR. And so far, we have reports from 123 countries which have reported extensive multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And what is most alarming is that we do not have new class of antibiotics. Still some are in pipeline, but not in the market since 1980s. The number of deaths attributable to AMR every year by 2050, it is comparable between North American countries and Europe, but which is worse in African countries and Asian countries. In particularly in Asia, the number of deaths would be around 4.73 million, and in Africa 4.15 million. So development of AMR in Salmonella typhi is the showcase example of evolution of AMR. We can see in 1948 the efficacy of chloramphenicol was discovered, and right after 2 years, in 1950 chloramphenicol resistance was reported, and in an evolution process in 2014 we found that ceftriaxone was effective, and right after 2 years in 2016 ceftriaxone resistance were reported from different countries. Regarding economic cost of AMR, if we fail to contain AMR, the world real GDP is supposed to decline significantly by 2050, and even if we contain the AMR partially, still there would be a remarkable decline in world GDP. We can classify the economic cost at patient perspective, hospital perspective, and societal perspective. Like from the patient's view, like it increases morbidity and mortality, and especially in the developing countries, if someone dies, the whole family suffers and forced into extreme poverty. And the higher the second line drugs, they have higher toxicity and direct non-medical patient care costs due to longer hospital stay. And from the hospital perspective, if we fail to contain AMR, there would be additional cost of surveillance and containment programs. The second line antibiotics are they cost higher price. Additional diagnostic tools would be needed, and there would be additional investment in isolation facilities. And when a patient stays longer, the cost gets higher. And from societal perspective, there would be hamper in trade and tourism. We also need alternative drugs. Implications for medical services. Productivity would be lost due to morbidity and mortality. So what are the actions we need to combat AMR? We use a word holistic invariably, and for containing AMR, we need holistic approach, like from personal perspective, from community mobilization, from involvement of countries and governments, intergovernmental organizations. So we need holistic approach. We need to optimize use of antibiotics from consumer level, from prescriber level. We need cheap and rapid diagnostic tests. For example, especially in low and middle income countries, at the primary care level, there is no laboratory facility to see susceptibility tests for antimicrobial agents. So the physicians or clinicians are forced to prescribe empirical antimicrobial therapy. So we need laboratory facilities. We need cheap rapid diagnostic tests. We need new antibiotics, alternative therapies, especially vaccines. We need infection prevention control measures. We need improved awareness and education at all level, from personal to policymakers. We need to, in some countries, there are already existing policies to combat AMR, but which are not implemented strictly. So these policies should be implemented strictly, and the funding agencies should patronize research on novel drugs and novel antimicrobial agents. Interventions to combat AMR, like restriction policies, and most of these restriction policies, the studies reported, those were hospital-based restriction policies, and those were found effective, like Evans and colleagues introduced hospital-based restriction policy, and they found that restrictions were effective in reducing injudicial prescribing. Clemo and colleagues, they also reported that after implementing the restriction policy, the number of cases of Clostridium difficile associated diarrhea was declined. Another intervention would be prescriber education. In United States, Gonzalez and colleagues, they implemented patient and clinician education program, and after implementation of this program, they found that the injudicious antibiotic use declined from 74% to 48%. Another Australian study reported that after implementation of such prescriber education program, it saved around 3.19 million Australian dollar over 2 years. Combination therapies. Scarfstein and colleagues, they examined the cost effectiveness analysis of different combination therapies with clarithromycin, and they found that to combat Mycobacterium avium complex in AIDS especially, it was cost effective. Another study reported, Vakil and colleagues, that combination antimicrobial therapies prevented the emergence of AMR. Vaccines. Vaccines could be the play a potential role in combating AMR, like pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. Jameela and colleagues, they reported that with an efficacy of 66%, the net benefit of that vaccine, it was 127 million US dollar with a benefit cost ratio of 2.3, and benefit per person was around 2,600 US dollar. Antibiotic resistance in the COVID-19, and the data we presented is like pre-pandemic data, and we all know that the injudicious misuse and overuse of antibiotics during this COVID-19 era, especially some of the antibiotics I would like to name, azithromycin and amoxicillin. These antibiotics went out of market due to infodemic, due to electronic media and social media. And another cause could be like a lack of or inadequate COVID-19 testing. For example, in the context of developing countries, if you go for COVID-19 testing, and it takes around 3 to 7 days to get your report, and meanwhile, the prescribers, they are over-prescribing antibiotics, and the consumers, they are, even without a prescription, they are using antibiotics at home. Future directions to combat, we need collaborative research, we need collaboration between governments, we need collaboration between academicians and clinicians. We need holistic approach to combat AMR. We have some advances in genetics, genomics, and computer sciences, and we need to utilize this advancement to identify new diagnostic tools and rapid diagnostic tools. And especially in the context of developing countries, we need to invest more in sanitation and basic health infrastructure, as it is supposed to be the most cost-effective interventions to combat AMR. In conclusion, as I said, like AMR cannot be managed personally. We need collaborative approach. We need integrative approach. And AMR in any corner of the world, it's a potential threat to the entire world. So we need to act like one. And AMR in any corner would affect the whole world. So I would like to thank the organizer for giving us the opportunity to talk on cost-effective interventions to combat antimicrobial resistance. Over you.
Thank you very much, Imran, for your presentation. And we do have a couple of quick questions. There is a question asking about what investment plans are put in place to ensure subsidization of availability of antibiotics and diagnostic tools in Asia and Africa, as they are more affected by AMR.
Okay, we need more research, like BMGF. They are funding a lot of. Last year, they had a call on research funding to combat AMR, to combat AMR, Salmonella AMR, and I think we need collaborative approach. The government should implement strict policies. The government can also fund in this rapid diagnostic tools. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. We also have two questions. The first one is, what about combating AMR through food and agriculture? Before I go to the other question, over to you.
Yeah, as I mentioned, like we need holistic approach. Besides personal perspective and hospital approach, we need to combat AMR in the environment. So definitely we need holistic approach.
Okay. There is also a question regarding the subject of the presentation, the cost-effectiveness interventions. In low-middle-income countries, as was mentioned in the session, in some of the presentations, prioritization of interventions to combat AMR has to be done. Any idea how this prioritization could be done based on the costs and the effectiveness of these interventions? Over to you.
Yeah, especially in the context of developing countries, the prioritization is very much essential. And I think, firstly, the government should, or the research agencies should implement on basic sanitation and hygiene measures, as it is evidenced to be the most cost-effective interventions, and then investing on vaccines, and then the other measures to combat. So firstly on basic sanitation and hygiene measures, and then vaccines.
Okay. The last question, you talked about IPC programs as one of the interventions to combat AMR. So the question is saying, how can we assist healthcare workers, especially those in primary health care, to appreciate the importance of IPC and also the need for senior managers to be fully engaged in IPC in healthcare facilities? Over to you.
During the undergraduate or postgraduate education, we can introduce IPC. I think there are some courses on IPC, but these are not to that extent that is needed. So I think in the undergrad and postgrad medical education, the IPC courses should be introduced, and practical sessions, hands-on training should be provided to the healthcare workers. And what I would like to add that most of the trainings, they are focused on clinicians or physicians and sparing the allied staffs like nurses or ward boys. So it needs training to the entire team, from physician to the ward cleaner. I think it can help.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I can add to your response regarding IPC, I think to increase the awareness of leaders and directors of IPC, countries need to have data on the burden of healthcare associated infections to utilize for advocacy and showing the importance of IPC in reducing the spread of those infections and for resistant healthcare associated infections and other infections also in the community. Thank you very much, Dr. Imran Hasan, for the nice presentation and the discussion. And I think we can now move to the fourth presentation. The title of the presentation is AMR in Neonates and Children with Sepsis in Low-Middle Income Countries. The presenter is Dr. Mike Sharland, St. George University Hospitals, NHS Foundation Trust, the United Kingdom. The presentation is a pre-recorded presentation. Please, over to the organizers to start.
Thank you much indeed for asking me to talk today on the critically important area of antimicrobial resistance in neonatal and children with sepsis in the low middle income. So there has been a number of studies recently that have come through to identify the sheer burden of antimicrobial resistance and the threat this now plays to access to effective treatment for sepsis, particularly for neonates. One of the studies that really brought this home more recently was the Dennis study from neonatal sepsis in hospitals in Delhi, looking at 15,000 babies admitted to their neonatal intensive care units. This study identified that the pathogens that are being identified now in neonatal sepsis, Acinetobacter and Klebsiella dominating in hospital setting, with also E. coli and Pseudomonas. Many of the pathogens showed a very high degree of resistance with a high case fatality rate. And you can see that for Acinetobacter, the rates of resistance to cephalosporins and is now extremely high, with a very high case fatality rate. There are other studies that have reviewed the percentages of resistance from bloodstream infection in Africa and Asia. And for Asia in particular again for Klebsiella, resistance rate to third generation cephalosporins and first line antibiotic treatments, WHO for sepsis and Pungent, is now up to 80% in many centers. There are other studies, ANISA, observational studies, and the trials, AfriNest and SAT in particular, that have identified the causes of neonatal sepsis and resistance rates in the community setting. There are individual country studies, but very few multi-center observational cohort studies for neonatal sepsis in the hospital setting, and to try and identify what are the pathogens and what are the resistance in those settings. It also has to be recognized that though we don't know which is the most important component of the burden of AMR in these settings, some of this will be maternal carriage of multi-resistant gram-negatives. Some of it will be acquisition at the time of birth, because of increasing facility-based births globally, and some of it will be postnatal acquisition. But either way, nosocomial infection in babies and young children is very different from healthcare-associated infections in adults. In adults, a different pattern of intra-abdominal infection, hospital-acquired pneumonia, complicated urinary tract infection is seen. But in babies and infants, healthcare-associated infection is much more commonly bloodstream infection. And for Klebsiella and the other pathogens, but this is associated, of course, clearly with a higher mortality. So HAI is BSI equals high mortality with multi-drug resistant pathogens. This is more emphasized by the recent data from the CHAMP study. This is a Gates-supported study of trying to determine the pathogens that are associated with mortality in of children and babies who have died in a community setting using minimally invasive tissue sampling techniques. There's a complicated process by which pathogens are identified as being important in the causal pathway of the death. But the early data from this study recently identifies Klebsiella as one of the most important pathogens in the causal pathway, being identified in 2/3 of both young infants as well as children. Klebsiella was recognized as a pathogen for neonates, but the CHAMPS data has reevaluated Klebsieller's role in young children, many of whom presented with the clinical signs of pneumonia in the community setting. This is early data. It should be treated with caution, but if this is confirmed, as CHAMPS expands up into other countries and other sites, then this will reevaluate the importance of AMR in community presentation and the role of multi-drug resistant gram-negative pathogens in that setting. One of the problems, I think, for pediatric sepsis in LMIC setting is this just limited data. So this is a systematic review and meta-analysis of the studies for pediatric sepsis, which recently published, and identified relatively few studies that were eligible for systematic review and meta-analysis, and that most of these were conducted 15 to 20 years ago, and we could identify no recent study, large prospective observational cohort study that will inform under the importance of the different underlying conditions, the treatment, and predictors of mortality. So we have very limited data in this recent data in this area. We have data on antibiotic treatment from point prevalence survey data. One has to be cautious about PPS because, again, this is biased towards tertiary hospitals. But as you can see in high-income countries, and for neonates, then penicillin, ampicillin, gentamicin for WHO first-line treatment for neonatal sepsis is still quite commonly used. Whereas at the other extreme, for children with pediatric sepsis, only 1% of children receive the WHO pediatric sepsis first-line recommendation, pen and gent, and only 13% receive the WHO second-line regimen, ceftriaxone, cefotaxime. So there is a significant amount of broad-spectrum antibiotic use, including carbapenem use, in nearly all the point prevalence surveys for neonates and children globally. So because of this, and to try and inform the design of future hospital-based neonatal sepsis study, GARD-P supported the NEOOB study, which was a prospective cohort study, babies with significant clinical sepsis. And this is now just completed, recruiting 3,204 babies from 19 sites in 11 countries. I won't go through all the details of the study. It's really just only finished, and the analysis is ongoing. But you can see the high rates is there in section. But the study does cover both inborn, but also babies born at home and admitted from the community. And not surprisingly, there was high rates of, as well as ampicillin gentamicin treatment, but high rates of broad spectrum antibiotic use, amikacin, meropenem, ceftaz, peptaz, across pretty well all of the settings internationally. And the pathogens, many of the babies were premature, and so Coagulase negative staph cons was probably still a significant pathogen in many of these babies with sepsis. But other gram-negatives dominated Klebsiella, Acinetobacter, Staph aureus, which a high portion was MRSA, and E. coli as well. Whereas pathogens identified as being important in the community setting, like Group B strep, were obviously less common in this hospital setting. So I think, in conclusion, we can say that neonatal mortality progress is slow at the moment, and antimicrobial resistance is a major threat to achieve the neonatal SDGs. But I think emerging data is emphasizing the importance of antimicrobial resistance in pediatric sepsis, particularly in young children, and particularly Klebsiella. And this is despite the fact that there's very, very few recent multi-center prospective LMIC pediatric sepsis. This means that we unfortunately have very limited data on the impact of treatment, antibiotic treatment, concordance on clinical outcome. We don't know what is the impact of receiving antibiotics for which your pathogen is resistant. GLASS has collected a lot of aggregate data for children and neonates, and this is really important data, but is now also collecting importantly hospital individual patient hospital mortality data. There is very high rates of antimicrobial resistance reported, though this is potentially biased with many confounders, and that may encourage more broad spectrum antibiotic prescribing, which of course may be appropriate, but sometimes may be less appropriate. And we need these large cohort studies to determine what are the modifiable mortality outcomes, where should the intervention be focused. Globally, we have a lot of antimicrobial resistance surveillance programs with GLASS now, but what we really need is clinical surveillance programs where we identify what are the clinical risk factors, what disease, which type of disease, underlying disease with the patient presenting with, what happened to this patient in terms of 28-day mortality outcomes. And this is the data that we need to try and inform how local and national guidance should reflect varying levels and changing patterns of resistance to WHO EML access, watch, and reserve antibiotics. What is important is that WHO is now producing guidance in a handbook for neonates and children and adults in the future, next year, and how these resistance patterns should feed into this guidance is going to be critical for the future. GARD-P has a very important strategy which is based on pragmatic, innovative global trials, optimization of prevention strategies, and of equal importance, treatment strategies, which include off-patent and new antibiotics, focused on trying to inform WHO guidance and where combinations of older off-patent antibiotics and novel antibiotics should fit into those treatment regimens in the future. So we want to thank all of the NeoOrbs collaborators, the research team, the patient families that made the study possible, and also thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the nice presentation. Unfortunately, we will not be able to get any questions to Mike Sharland. We can proceed to the last but not least presentation in session 3. The title of the presentation is Antimicrobial Stewardship in Limiting Multi-Drug Resistant Organisms. And I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Jameela Alsalman from the Ministry of Health in Bahrain. Dr. Jameela is an ID physician. She's leading the IPC program and she's leading the Antimicrobial Stewardship program in Bahrain. Over to you, Dr. Jameela.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Maha, for the nice introduction. It's really my pleasure to join the elite speaker. The presentation today about the antimicrobial stewardship in limiting the MDRO. The outline of my presentation will go for the problem of MDRO, and I think the previous presenter really has gone through it, and it's really very important to notice. Then the antimicrobial stewardship rule in controlling MDRO, and antimicrobial stewardship with COVID-19. That's very important to look into it. A couple of slides about Bahrain experience and some regional perspective. In regard to the antimicrobial stewardship, we all know at this stage it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, but we have certain facts that can lead us and really guide us in how to deal with this problem. So the basic concept of medicine, and we know it, is really to do no harm, at least. And this is what the whole idea about antimicrobial stewardship, how to make whatever we are doing in daily basis with the patient, not to really harm the patient at the end. Why we are targeting antimicrobials, why they are there? Because we know, whatever kind of study you look at it from different regions or from different countries, is that around like 30% to up to 50% of our hospitalized patients are taking antibiotic, and actually third and half of them are inappropriate or unnecessary. And that at the end leads to increase in antimicrobial resistance, morbidity, mortality, the collateral damage, like C. diff, and increase in the cost. So it's really the main driver of resistance at large. So we know that the emergence of resistance really impact what we are seeing. Most of the hospital-acquired infection that we are seeing are secondary to multi-drug resistant organism. At least most of them are resistant to the first-line antimicrobial therapy. And that's lead to more of increased morbidity, mortality, and hospital care cost at the end. There are major elements. It's gram-positive, it's gram-negative, but most of the concern we are seeing, probably even our region, is the gram-negative. The escape, what we said, the ESBL, the carbapenem-resistant, MDRO, Pseudomonas, and Acinetobacter. If you look, for example, we are relating it, relating the use of antibiotic to the gram-negative, we can look at it a different way. First of all, if you look at the majority of ICU infection, it's really related to the multi-drug resistant negative organism. So that's what we see in our ICU or a high dependency area. It's very clear. The other part of the story is seeing the organism per se. If you have Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, or Klebsiella, if it is sensitive, the mortality is very low, comparing it to the resistant organism. And that's because of the nature of this organism and resistant pattern, and because of what I'll show in the next slide, is that if you have a resistant organism, your outcome will be different, which means that inappropriate antibiotic use actually is within, if you have resistant organism, is an independent risk factor, almost 3.4 in increasing the risk of death. So the antibiotic leads to resistant. At the same time, if you have resistant microorganism in your institution and it's high, that will lead to more of inappropriate use of antibiotic. So this is another slide which showed you that the inappropriate therapy is a major risk factor that we can modify it. It's in our hand, and that is where our all efforts for antibiotic stewardship deal with it. The other, whether you are looking for ESBLs or CREs, and this study actually, which was published in 2006, looking into the risk factor of having an ESBL producing enterobacteriasis. And if you look at it, prior cephalosporin, prior carbapenem use is really a major factor. If you go for carbapenem resistant, like carbapenem resistant Klebsiella pneumonia, you will see the same factor. If you have prior fluoroquinolone use or prior carbapenem use, also it's a risk factor of having those MDRO in your institution. Previous study, there are multiple studies that has been published. This is just an example. If you have a restricted use of antibiotic, your rate of the MDRO is less than if you have unrestricted use of antibiotic. So if we can put all this into one statement, is that whether you are using antibiotic inappropriately, it will lead to resistance. At the same time, the resistance will lead you to more of inappropriate use. When we talk about inappropriate use of antibiotic, it really has a lot of factors. We know as physicians, we talk about pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, all really impact how appropriate we are using the antibiotics. My colleague in previous presentation, they mentioned that really the problem of increasing MDRO organism in our institution is really not really going hand in hand with what's available from the new antibiotic. Yes, we have a couple of them. Are they covering everything? Are they covering all the spectrum that we needed? And how effective are they when we use them? So that leads to concept of antimicrobial stewardship. So at this stage, we know that the appropriate use of antibiotic, it's the core elements, in antimicrobial stewardship. So you have to use the right agent, right dose, right time, appropriate duration, so you can decrease the cost, prevent infection, and decrease the resistant pattern in your institution. The recent guidelines 2016 from IDSA, they went really about implementation, the details of implementation. How do you do it? What you target? And how effective is it in targeting the problem in your institution? So when we talk about quality of care, yes, it's very important. When you start your antimicrobial stewardship in your institution, it's all about patient safety. It's controlling costs, yeah, it's important. But at the end, it decreases the resistant pattern. So it's all working together. It's very important when you are doing it, you are looking to the bigger picture. Coming to Bahrain example and regional perspective. In Bahrain, we started our antimicrobial stewardship programs in 2011, actually a long time ago. We started in small scale and we were developing it by the time. Once we get more confident in how we deal with it, we went to the major hospital, teaching hospital, and then to the primary care outpatient setting, which was not really easy and it was not done probably at that time, but we found really good results. And now we are at national stage. A lot of good outcomes of it. We have got, a number of publications in Bahrain just to see what we have and what direction we have to target. The other part of it, we have a lot of collaborative work because people were looking to the experience. Sharing experience was very, very crucial at that stage. What we have, and we are learning from the rest. So we have a lot of really sharing with the rest of the world in the region and internationally, and with the international societies. So, and really, it got a lot of awards regarding this practice from the higher level in our country to international, actually, recognition. Part of the GLASS system, we are one of the countries that participated with WHO on the GLASS system. And, I just showed a couple of examples here. For example, this is the Acinetobacter, comparing the upper part is the 2019 and the lower part is the 2018. And there is, the comparison, if you compare both, we did really very well. Not in all of the organisms. This is, for example, in Klebsiella pneumonia, but at least we maintain it with the efforts we have with the antimicrobial stewardship. This is the same applied to the gram-positive like Staph aureus. We maintain the resistance. And I think we know at this stage, if it's not increasing, this is still a good news. We are all looking to decrease it. We could have, through the GLASS system, actually know what's hospital-acquired and what's community-acquired. And this is where we targeted our outpatient and primary care, because we know a large number of our ESBL, E. coli at least, with urine tract infection coming from the community. It's not only antibiotic use in hospital, it's also what we have. We have actually developed, software for Bahrain to include all the hospitals, governmental and private, and collect all the data and try to analyze it. And actually, this is the details, not probably because this is the largest picture. You see, at one stage, we start to have, most of the governmental hospital, and this is in the main hospital, and we implement the stewardship program. We decrease the antibiotic, and we try to maintain it over the last couple of years. At one stage, you will not be able to decrease it further because you will remain having those patients that are still, you use the antibiotic appropriately to save lives. And this is just a bigger picture, how the antibiotic, how you divide them, calculating our daily divided dose and duration of therapy also. We had the same experience in primary care. Actually, we piloted at the beginning, and then over the last few years, you'll see really a major decrease in consumption. And that really helped us really in decreasing or maintaining our, rate of MDRO in Bahrain. We moved to antimicrobial stewardship and COVID-19. Really, we are with this pandemic COVID-19. There are a lot of issues. There were, this is an article which was published in Journal of Hospital Infection. But it's very important. There are a lot of important factors here. Our experience in Bahrain, we saw that, and there are a couple of literature studies about it, increased use of empiric antibiotic. When you have patients coming with COVID pneumonia, there is trend from the physician to cover them with antibiotic, which is not good in all cases. Efforts in antibiotic stewardship, we are maintaining it, but really the focus, whether we like it or not, has been deviated to COVID-19 care altogether. The infection control measures, yes, it is much, much better with the COVID-19, all of us know. But at the end of the road, we are talking about the healthcare worker protecting themselves from getting COVID-19. But at the same time, we are taking about this care, taking care of the same patient, the same cubic. If any one of them develop, ESBL or CRE, it will really reach the other patients if we are not careful. They are getting more immunocompromised and patients with comorbidities with the COVID-19 admissions. And these are the people who actually had previous admission and there have been an antibiotic, so they are at risk also of having it. Prolonged length of stay. we know now at this stage that people who are admitted with moderate, severe pneumonia, or even critical ARDS, they stay with us more than 2 weeks. So, and we know that prolonged stay promote more antibiotic and more MDRO. Dealing with the outbreaks. So if you have an ICU and you have one CRE or ECBL or MRSA, and this is an outbreak within a COVID-19 facility, you have to be very careful to how to address it and deal with it. Actually, WHO, they issue great statements about where to put the stewardship within the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was very clearly to incorporate the advice to incorporate antibiotic stewardship principle within the specific recommendation. And really not to forget about it while we are all busy in combating COVID-19. The last part of my presentation actually is the regional perspective. We are all suffering with the MDRO, and we know that no single country is exempted. In our region, when I talk about the GCC Gulf cooperation countries or even the Middle East countries, we have certain specification. Even the trend of MDRO, whether gram-negative or positive, but we have more problem with the gram-negative. It's different. So there have been a lot of efforts in the region really to target it, to clear, to go around, to see and analyze all the data and to see how we can do it better. It's very clear. If you look at, the left side of the slide, is the countries, which has really had increased consumption over the last 15 years of antibiotic. It's in our region. There are several of them from our region. And in the right side of the slide, this is, this is from the WHO status. We are, trying our best. If you see, like Bahrain has probably lower, this is like, a couple of years data. But, at the end, still we are facing the same problem, and there are more efforts has to be really taken in consideration in this era. This is another slide also from the WHO and shows through the glass system, the AMR within Eastern Mediterranean region. Still, we have the problem, and it has to be addressed. Maybe we have to speed up the rate of even our efforts. If it takes 1 month to do something, we have to do it in days, and if it's 1 year, it has to be done in 1 month. So we are in the region, we collectively worked with a group of really the best of, we have experts in the region. We get together. It's a small group representing several countries in the region, and we did several efforts. We've been working over the last 3 years, almost 3 years. One of the things that we try to do, we did a workshop, try to analyze what's happening, what's our regional challenges. And these are the same as WHO, what they found. There are internal challenges and external challenges that had to be addressed if we are really looking to decrease the rate of MDRO. What we did, we look at the similarities. What we are as a region have similar, and what are the differences? So we can put like guidance, we can put guidelines, we can help each other. So the country which is more like strong in, basic data, basic lab, they can help the other. People had experience in stewardship, they can share their experience with the other countries. So based on this, we looked also at the antimicrobial stewardship program in each country, what's implemented, what's not per country, to see what are, the strength and the weakness, and to build on it, not to start from really zero. We put 5 key areas, that can provide solution to the region. It goes in training, education, basic elements, building capacity, very, very strong, recommendation. Really, we need a lot. We don't have all the luxury and all the manpower that we need. Then we recommended also to improve regional surveillance, very important, infrastructure, strengthening and support, and enhancing regional research. If you compare the amount of research getting out of our region, it's really not up to the rate of international, but it's picking up, and really we are in a better situation within the last 5 years. The same group, really, we had the collaboration with the BSAC, the British Society of Antimicrobial Agents, and we established a program, Gulf, Middle East, and North Africa Antimicrobial Stewardship Program, if anybody is interested. We work with them, we had it, it really took time, but I think we are getting a great feedback from it. And it's helpful because you cannot go to each hospital or each country to teach them what you have, but you can have a platform where you go with the e-learning. And especially with the COVID-19, we are all changing the way we are doing our work. And, at the end, this was the article that just published, if you like, it's management of infection caused by WHO, critical priority gram-negative organism. pathogen in Arab countries of the Middle East. So it really, we spent 1 year to try to reach this, to get the data. The most difficult part of it was really how much basic published data we have about the rate of MDRO in our countries. Really, it was tough, but at the end, we could have get something, and it's already published. And in this, that was the most part, what we have exactly. There are some data, it's really, vary from country to country, but we depend on the published data and the GLASS system data to help us actually guide our management guidelines. So in conclusion, we know that, that there is a high proportion of resistance, and we are facing it. It's affecting our, health system, the outcomes, the health, cost, morbidity, and mortality. The treatment option, running out of it. We have new items, we have new antibiotics, how much it can help. Still, by using them, you probably lose them at the end. It's really very important, and I think everybody agrees. It's stewardship plus major implementation for all measures of infection control to be able to control those MDRO. And really, regard to our region, we really look into more research, more into depth look, analyzing our data, what we have to address all the critical issue. So basically, you have two ways: either to address it to avoid any crisis, or really to work on it to have a success. Thank you very much for listening and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jameela, for your comprehensive presentation. Actually, we do have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to pick some of them. There is a question regarding how did you gain the government support for your antimicrobial stewardship programs? Because I guess this is faced by many countries where they do not have this political will or political support. So the floor is yours, Dr. Jameela.
Thank you very much. I think it's really clear for everybody. Even if you go to the CDC guidance, and guidelines for the structure of antimicrobial stewardship, its leadership commitment is number one. So you can proceed. For gaining, and I think this is where you have to make your business case. If you are starting your antimicrobial stewardship program, you are the scientific part. You have to make it really sounds, it's of benefit to everybody. So this is what we did in Bahrain. We started on small scale. We then built on it. We show your hospital management that it's worth it to invest in antimicrobial stewardship. And then, we prove for them it decreased the rate of infection, it decreased the cost, which is very important, decreased the length of stay. And then you have to put it in the most, scientific way to the higher authority and leadership in your institution or your Ministry of Health. And this is where you get the support, because you have to make and you have to prove that it really works. And with the efforts you have, it will help them actually to guide the efforts, to guide the manpower or the cost to your project and your program. So a lot of work has to be done by us, by the infection control and the antimicrobial stewardship program, so you can get the help you need. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you talked about the business case that has to be put to senior health officials to get their support. And this requires a lot of groundwork, a lot of data collection, showing the case, doing surveillance, doing resistance surveillance, antibiotic use studies, and a lot of work to get the data for each country to utilize for advocacy. We do have also another question. You talked about AMS and COVID-19, and we all know from the region that so many antibiotics were used either for prophylactic or inappropriately for the COVID-19 pandemic. Any future expectations for what will happen as a result of this use of antibiotics for COVID-19?
Based on what we are seeing, really, it depends, because, we have different facilities and different, each facility is for different kind of patient who are mild and moderate or severe and critical. The patient who are in severe or critical and they need more of ICU care, there is an increased use of antibiotic, and that's for sure. And we started to see, the CRA are showing in the picture. Initially, it was lower, but then it's increasing. At the same time, and I think what we saw in the rest of the hospital, because it was really balancing. We know that we divert a lot of our efforts on combating the COVID-19, but I know that in a lot of health systems, they have to cut back on elective admission, elective surgeries. So at the other side of the story, you will have decreased length of stay. People want to go home. They don't want to stay in the hospital. So that probably will help in decreasing some cases of MDRO. But the care where we're giving in COVID area with the prolonged admission in ICU, I'm sure that it will impact it, and we will see increase who are coming up for the patient who are coming out from those facilities.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an interesting vision for the future. We have one last question regarding what strategies were used to encourage clinicians. Did these focus on the prescribers or supply pharmacy monitoring, as they noticed that you have a very positive reduction in use of antibiotics? Over to you.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think it's all the above. One thing about this antimicrobial stewardship, you cannot just implement one intervention or initiative and you think it will decrease your antibiotic consumption. That will not work. It's really, you have to do a close monitoring from the pharmacy. Yes, the data, how many is used, but to decrease it literally, you need a lot of education. You have to make all the physician as partner in your stewardship program. You have to have regular meeting, regular feedback to be given to them. If you ask them for the support and they understand your concept, they have to be part of it. They have to have the ownership of being part of the stewardship. Within our field, the field of medicine, we know that, people, they don't like to get like orders from other subspecialties. Each subspecialty, they know what they are doing, but to make them, not to enter their area of subspecialty, you have just to deal with them as partners, give them more education and to give them feedback. At the same time, your education has to be very, it has to be like continuous. There is no point of giving one lecture or one workshop and go. Because what we notice after we're giving any program of education, the consumption of antibiotic decrease and just leave it for 2 to 3 months and again pick up. So you have to be very, very good in tailoring the message, what kind of education, how often you have to give it to really get the cooperation you need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jameela. And this was the last question. Before we conclude the session, I would like to thank all speakers for excellent presentations. I'd like to thank our audience for being interactive and providing comments and questions to the speakers. Thank you very much, everyone, and wish you a successful continuation of the Congress session. And I'm announcing over this session.